All right. Welcome to the New York Preservation Archive Project's Coffee Break Chat. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces out there and so many faces of people that I don't yet know, but I'm looking forward to getting to know you in the course of today's event, whether that's through the chat or through questions. But we're so glad that you're here to join us today. I think we're going to have a great program. The Coffee Break Chat, though, should start with, because this is a coffee break chat, a toast. And so if you happen to have your coffee handy, please join me in raising a glass and a toast to Clay Lancaster and his legacy in New York City. Cheers.
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 Excellent.
Cheers.
Okay. Well, I wanted to say at the outset a little bit about the New York Preservation Archive Project. Many of you know about our work, but we are a nonprofit organization focused on New York City in particular, and the history of historic preservation. Now, you might say that's a bit meta, but what we found is that over the decades, preservationists have been working tirelessly to try to preserve some of the great buildings and the great neighborhoods in the city. And ultimately, they kick up a lot of dust, let's just put it that way. And someone has to be doing the work of actually collecting all of that human effort. And we do that through oral histories, through a preservation database, and through public programming like this. And it's all an effort to make sure that we're making preservationists' work worthwhile, to make sure that that memory persists. And also, very importantly, to inspire preservationists out there to take action when they see something in their own neighborhood that they can make a difference with. So before we get into things, 2 items on housekeeping. We have a sponsor for our coffee break series, which is CTA Architects PC. So special thanks to them for helping make this possible. And today we are also doing something a little bit different. I am going to share a file with you all here. Just one moment. It'll take me 1 second to get this pulled up. But we are actually, someone is mentioning Mr. Lancaster's book. Well, it just so happens that we are going to be giving away a copy today of that book. So hold on 1 second here. And you can see in the shared file that I just shared in the chat, a copy of that, that's Old Brooklyn Heights. And you can see behind me in my profile, in the vivid blue, a shot of the cover of that book. Now, today, we are grateful, of course, always as a small nonprofit going through a pandemic, for any kind of little donation or tip you might want to send our way. So I'm going to post the link to our PayPal donation site, and for anyone who donates during the course of today's program, you will have a chance to be entered to win a copy of that book. So one moment, and let me post that donation link in the chat. And let's get going with our intro so you know who's speaking here today. We have, again, I know that many of you on the program today know quite a few of the people involved, but you might not know all of them. We have a special guest after all. But first and foremost, I'd like to introduce 2 people who are just wonderful people, Otis and Nancy Pearsall. They were absolutely essential leaders in the 1950s and 1960s, helping to spearhead the push to landmark Brooklyn Heights as a city historic district, even before a legal framework existed to do so. So that gives you some sense of the intensity and the fervor of their efforts. But they were some of the original Brownstoners, and Otis and Nancy remain residents of Brooklyn Heights to this day. Their reputations as award-winning civic figures and community leaders precede them, and they remain active preservationists to this day. I also want to note that Otis was the recipient of the New York Preservation Archive Project's 2019 Preservation Award. So welcome, Otis and Nancy.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And now moving on to another character who sometimes is seen in the preservation circles in New York City, Anthony C. Wood. He's the founder of NYPAP. He's a preservationist, author, teacher, historian, grant maker, currently the executive director of the Idelson Foundation. And for over 20 years, he served as a member of the adjunct faculty of the Graduate Historic Preservation Program at Columbia. He is the author of Preserving New York, Winning the Right to Protect a City's Landmarks. Welcome, Mr. Wood.
Thank you, Brad. Great to be here.
And finally, our special guest, someone who knew Clay and knows Clay's work, and I'm so excited to get your insights. During the course of prepping for this event, basically our next speaker delivered a trove of materials that I think is going to take us some time to unpack, quite frankly. We might actually have to have an entire another program just to go through all of those materials. But James D. Birchfield. James D. Birchfield serves as curator of rare books at the University of Kentucky. He is the former president of the Warwick Foundation, an organization that promotes the Clay Lancaster legacy through education, preservation, and facilitation of cross-cultural understanding. He is joining us today from Kentucky, and he is the author of Clay Lancaster's Kentucky, Architectural Photographs of a Preservation Pioneer. So without further ado, I would like to hand things over to Mr. Wood.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. Part of what the Archive Project does is we like to lift up preservationists who are too important, too inspiring, and too fascinating to be forgotten in the passage of time. And Clay Lancaster certainly fills the bill on that in many, many ways. So we're delighted to be able to hopefully lift him up to refresh the memories of those who knew him and introduce him to new generations of preservationists. So I think Brad is going to be putting on the screen some images. And so that is going to hopefully happen momentarily.
Yep.
Because
moment.
Brad?
If I could add something, there's one other person we should mention. Down at the lower left of my screen is Gay Redding, Wendell Redding, and he's probably the longest serving member of the Bluegrass Trust for Historic Preservation, and probably the longest person around who knew Clay Lancaster from when he was a kid. So
wow.
He's also in the Warwick Foundation. He's a treasurer of the Warwick Foundation.
Thank you for calling out his presence. That is terrific. And we will, at a certain moment, remember to unmute his mic so yes, we can get him to join us towards the end of the program. So wonderful to have that. Okay, Brad, are you going to split our screens for us?
Yep, just one moment.
Okay, great. Well, you know, Clay Lancaster is a figure that I've heard about for years. And I wanted to start with this image here because I think it kind of captures so much about him. And it's always intrigued my imagination because in this one frame, you get a sense for his energy, his enthusiasm, his ability to command an audience, a sense of his style, and obviously kind of a joie de vivre in that smile of him. So today we're going to hear, you know, some of his accomplishments to kind of set the stage, but then also really try and get a better sense of him as a person. And I think the way to regard today's program, as Brad suggested, this is just a teaser. Here, he's a figure that deserves more than a coffee break chat. So when life returns to normal, we hope maybe we can do a more traditional program with him, about him, to kind of lift up the fuller story. So what we're going to do, just to give you a sense of how this conversation is going to unfold, is we're going to start by focusing on his importance to kind of preservation in New York City, which is kind of where some of us who know him kind of where the first intersection is. We're then going to evolve and hear more about his importance to preservation beyond New York City, chapters that only become clear to some of us as we've researched this. And then we're going to focus hopefully the most of the program to find out more about him as a person, his incredible drive. He was a Buddhist, a vegetarian, a yoga teacher, all of which is, what do we say, woke today? But when he was in doing all that, he was, you know, he was kind of on the cutting edge, so a fascinating individual. So let us start with the focus on his importance in New York City. And Otis, maybe you could kind of just begin by telling us kind of the wonderful first contact you had with Clay when you were trying to pull together and document the case for the importance of saving Brooklyn Heights, and you needed somebody with architectural chops to help make that happen. So Otis, do you want to pick up the narrative there?
Sure. In the beginning of '59, the big thing that was happening was that the City Planning Commission was looking to establish a new zoning ordinance for the city. And we saw an opportunity there, perhaps, to attach to that zoning ordinance a historic zoning ordinance of some kind. And there was to be an initial hearing in April with in City Hall, and another one in May, in sometime in the middle of May, to introduce the zoning ordinance. And we saw those as potential targets for getting our idea of an ordinance before the commission and the public. And there were two elements to that. A gentleman by the name of Arden Rathkoff undertook the preparation of a draft ordinance. And by the beginning of April, he had one in hand. I didn't agree with it particularly, because what I wanted was a slimmed down Brooklyn Heights only ordinance, thinking we could slip through the cracks before anybody hardly noticed us. He felt that it was going to be necessary to do it on a citywide basis. We were both in the end being right, because it did take a citywide mechanism, and we weren't able to get a Brooklyn Heights only thing. But I was right in that it entangled us in a struggle that lasted 3 years between the time that we were ready to go and the time the Landmarks Commission statute was ultimately passed. So my job was to see if we could develop some evidence that Brooklyn Heights actually qualified as a potential historic district. Did we have the evidence? And so through a neighbor actually across the street, a woman who wrote a book on the Dutch houses of Brooklyn, I became connected to Henry. I don't know whether it was basically, I don't know which of them came first, but in any event, I talked to at least 3 notable preservation, architectural preservationist, architectural people, and none of them wanted to take on the job of producing the evidence for Brooklyn Heights. But each one of them pointed out that we had exactly the right candidate living at the corner of Cranberry Street and Willow Street in the person of Clay Lancaster. Well, you know, we were beggars can't be choosers, and so naturally we thought maybe Clay Lancaster was our man, and we slipped a letter into his box on April 1, '59. We had to do it that way because, you know, he never had a telephone until ultimately in '78, he moved back to Kentucky to a remote location where he absolutely had to have a phone. He did not have a phone. Man of principle. The next day, we met with him, and he was eager to undertake the assignment. He had thought about doing it on his own for a long time, just had no reason to get to it. And so within a week, the Brooklyn Heights Press published an article saying that he had started his survey. The long and short of it is that we never had any evidence to present at the April or May meetings. But 2 years later, we had a book. We've been talking about the book. And in the meantime, he was a powerful force. He was a wonderful speaker. He had any number of slide lectures throughout the Heights. The biggie was the 1960 Brooklyn Heights Association annual meeting, where we had 700 people to hear Clay and Richard Howland, his friend, who was the president of the National Trust, explaining why we had to get an historic district. He conducted walking tours. He wrote several articles in the Brooklyn Heights Press, and in no time became a rock star in Brooklyn Heights. And in July of '61, the mayor appointed a committee. It had an incredible name, this committee. It was called the, let's see if I have it here. It was the Committee for the Preservation of Structures of Historic and Aesthetic Importance. How's that for a committee name?
It's a very zippy title.
And everything seemed to come to a head in the fall of '61. Clay's book came out. We had advance copies in October. We got together with the president of the Municipal Art Society in a wonderful apartment of Gladys James to get to know each other and to talk about the Clay book and how Brooklyn Heights had to be an historic district. He was a member of the new committee. He left very enthusiastically and wrote a letter to Jeffrey Platt, who was the chairman of the committee, in which he was all set to go with our standalone idea of a Brooklyn Heights only historic district, full of enthusiasm. That didn't come to pass, as I'll mention. But,
Otis, I'm going to interrupt you a little bit.
That's fine.
Because I don't want to do a total focus on how all the various hoops you all had to jump through to get that district finally done. But there was something you mentioned, and I wanted to ask Nancy about it, because if my memory is right, she was a player in it. And then we mentioned that survey work that had to be done. And I think I remember seeing a picture, Nancy, of you with a form filling out information on buildings. And I guess my question was, did you get to work yourself also with Clay as one of those volunteers? And here's a man with no phone. He must have been an interesting person to be working with.
He was fun, and he kept you entertained and elucidated. He kept teaching me architectural history. I loved going into houses and looking at houses with him because he knew exactly which molding was which period and so on. It was fabulous. And then we did some, in that period, we did 2 big maps, one by style and one by date, that we trekked around to show people how things worked. And I would have questions about how to interpret the outlines of buildings and which one was which and so on. He always answered them with grace and charm. It was just terrific.
And if my memory is right, those maps still exist, don't they? Are they in the...
They're at the Brooklyn Historical Society.
Yeah, so
the sort of amazing thing in those days, if you wanted colors on a big piece of paper, you had to color them in by hand. And I had the most amazing group of volunteers who were so incredibly overqualified, who came and spent hours coloring in boxes on those maps so that we would get the preservation statute.
Including the vice director of the Brooklyn Museum, Ian White.
Oh, I love it. Well, on the screen now is an early version of Clay's book. And one of our fans and supporters, Joan Davidson, who can't be with us but sends her best, pointed out that the building is a picture of a house that she used to live in Brooklyn Heights back when she was a Brooklynite. So all of these things come together. So how long was Clay involved through the designation process? Because I know at a certain point, and I'm going to ask Jim about it, he left New York, but was he here through the passage of the law and then the hearing, or had he at that point moved on?
He remained until the summer of, or the late part of 1970, and remained actively involved in all things preservation in Brooklyn Heights, a beloved character.
Oh, that's terrific. Jim, maybe you could, because you know his history so well, help us also understand what brought him to Brooklyn Heights in the first place, what got him to New York, and then also what caused him to leave New York.
Yes. Well, I think Clay had been interested in New York for a long time, and Gay Redding will have more to say about this, perhaps. Uh, his father had a shoe store and would go to trade shows in New York, and Clay would go up to New York and he would go to the museums and go to the theater. He loved the theater. And then when he was at UK, the University of Kentucky, he went up to the Art Students League and studied at the Art Students League. He did a master's, a bachelor's and a master's in art at the University of Kentucky. And then he wanted to do work on a PhD at Columbia. And he worked in the Avery Library, the architecture library there. And needless to say, he enjoyed New York a great deal, and that's where he wanted to be.
And then what led him to leave New York?
Otis has notes on this too, and I've heard Gay talk about it as well, that he had a burglary, and some of his artifacts that he had collected were stolen, and he wanted to get away. He had a friend named Barker who was an art dealer in Nantucket, and Jimmy Barker tempted him to come to Nantucket, and he stayed there until 1978. So he was there for a number of years, and then moved back to Kentucky in 78.
We're going to circle back again to the Brooklyn Heights narrative, but since so many people don't know of his preservation work beyond that, maybe you could tell us a little about, I know he did a book on Nantucket, restored a house there, and then of course the Kentucky period. So maybe you could just give us a flavor for his work beyond New York.
Yes. Yes, Clay did some books that were of national interest. One was The Japanese Influence in America. Another was The American Bungalow. And he had considerable breadth of worldwide arts and architecture. And he wrote and lectured on those topics. When Clay was interested in photography and took lots of photographs, including Brooklyn Heights, and we helped contribute photographs of Brooklyn Heights that he did to a show at the Brooklyn Heights, the Brooklyn Historical Society. You can't see this too well, but this is a book on New York interiors at the turn of the century that Clay did, about interior architecture and interior decoration. And then here's a book that Clay did on Nantucket. And he did several books on Nantucket, in fact. And then here is another book on Nantucket that Clay did. And he did a book on Greek revival in Alabama. The AIA in Alabama tempted him to come do a book on Greek revival there. And he had studied with Talbot Hamlin at Columbia, who was the head of the Avery Library, and he did a book on the Greek revival in America. And Clay was always turning up interesting things. And he was at the Library of Congress and going through a stack of drawings of Virginia houses. And in going through this stack of drawings of Virginia houses, he found a drawing of a villa by Benjamin Latrobe. And it turns out that he knew this building very well because it was really in Lexington, not in Virginia. And so he wrote quite a number of articles about Palladianism in American architecture and how Lexington Villa was a part of that. So his interests were quite varied. And he wrote not just about architecture, he wrote about architectural follies in America was another one. So he wrote children's books that in a way related to that. He did a book called The Flight of the Periwinkle that was essentially his book about architectural follies in America done for children, where they go from one interesting place to another interesting place. And he also built architectural follies at his place on the Kentucky River. He built a replica of the Tower of the Winds in Athens, and he built a Georgian tea room, also a banqueting house. And we have another 80 acres there. Which if he had lived long enough, he would have kept building follies. We would have had 80 acres of follies.
Tony and Jim, I'm just actually going to flip through our slides just to fast forward based on some of the things we're speaking about.
Yes. Oh,
While you're doing that, there was a wonderful sentence written about him by Roger Moss in the intro to Clay Lancaster's Kentucky, where he wrote, Clay Lancaster was infected by a love of architecture at an early age, a gentle madness from which he never cared to recover. Kind of sums that up nicely. But as you're pointing out, you know, he was a multi-dimensional individual. I mean, architecture was clearly a passion and a focus of a lot of his work. But it's also clear that he had interests, passions seriously pursued well beyond architecture.
Yes, that's certainly true. He was very interested in Oriental art, and he was an art collector in a way. And one way that he was an art collector is when people came to see him, they would bring him presents, and he was a documentarian, not just of architecture, but of everything. And he kept file cards on all of the items, everything that he had, ivory carvings of Buddha, or watercolors of moon gates, or scroll paintings of Japanese scenes. And so he had a very nice collection. And Gay Redding, the fellow that I mentioned, organized an exhibition at the Headley Whitney Museum here, just showing Clay's art collection and his furnishings. So he was very, very interested in anything aesthetic.
How did Clay manage to make all of this happen? I mean, all the books, the collection, the building properties. Did he get fees for the work? Did he inherit money? I mean, how did he make all these wonderful things happen for so many years?
They sold the family farm.
Yes, yes, he retired a multimillionaire. But actually, Clay was rather ascetic. And I think he was just simply obsessed with ideas and work. And he would work every day until 2 o'clock in the morning, writing at his typewriter or doing research. There's no internet.
He drew everything.
And drew. He was constantly drawing. He loved to draw maps. If you look at the end papers of many of these books, he's made either imaginary or documentary maps. And his parents, I think, sent him money. I think he was subsidized, and he was always giving people advice for free. I mean, he has a whole drawer of drawings and things that he's done of various houses in Kentucky, where he was giving people advice on restoration and correspondence about what they should do. For example, the house that we're sitting in here, it was sold to a friend of his named Miss Iva Dagley, and he writes to her and he says, Iva, that house was designed by Downing, and he says he doesn't like houses that are white with green shutters. Whatever you do, don't paint it. And she immediately painted it white with green shutters. But he was very generous in giving lectures. Ask Clay to give a lecture, he would come and bring his slides and give a lecture for you. Or if you wanted to chat with him, he would talk with you. If you asked him to dinner, you got into big problems, because he was very, very picky about what he ate. He was a vegetarian and a vegan. So if you had squash, that was great. If you had roast beef, well, you need not ask him.
And remember, now we're talking the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. So I mean, he was ahead of the health pack there. But yes. I'm glad we're kind of getting into more about him as a person. And I'm wondering if Brad, if Gay would like to make some comments to kind of open his mic if it isn't open already.
Yes, Gay would be a good commentator.
Gay?
I think my family knew Clay in Lexington, but I actually first met him in Brooklyn Heights when I was a teenager. Went to his house for lunch before he moved back to Kentucky, and we were in close contact from then on. I think in the New York connection, Clay's broader interests fascinate me. The Warwick Foundation purpose is to perpetuate Clay's legacy. Well, what is it? We can concern ourselves with almost anything, especially in the realm of cross-cultural communication and understanding, which was probably at the root of his considerations. A lot of the study of who Clay knew in New York has not been documented very well, and was probably absolutely fascinating. He was part of the circle around Lincoln Kirsten and the ballet and theater and Asian studies in New York City. And he was extremely attracted to that. But he and Daniel Boone had something in common. They didn't want any neighbors, so.
Well, you know, one of the interesting things looking at his work is he basically helped people really appreciate neighborhoods and places, Brooklyn Heights, Nantucket, that, as I understand it, then became so full of people that he
Yeah.
felt he wanted to go find solace and solitude back in Kentucky.
And that's why Daniel Boone moved to Missouri.
Because Kentucky was too overpopulated. Well,
Right.
apparently not overpopulated enough for Clay, which is good. You know, when you mention his range of interests, we should also point out when he was in New York, I may get the title wrong, but I think he was he the first curator of Prospect Park?
Yes.
An interest in parks too, and I guess landscape design.
Right.
It's pointed by Mayor Lindsay.
Right. And so you can see Clay here on the screen in front of the Litchfield Villa, formerly Grace Hill, in Prospect Park with the bullhorn speaking to crowds. And he also significantly authored the Prospect Park Handbook that you can see here, which goes into significant depth about the history of the park and the many structures there. So that's Olmsted and Vaux. And as curator, he also was very good friends with Marianne Moore, the poet. And for those of you who know your inside baseball, pun intended, given Marianne Moore's predilection to throw out pitches for the Brooklyn Dodgers, inside baseball with Prospect Park, though, is that she wrote a poem called The Camperdown Elm to help save the most famous tree in the park that is still there today. And in this Prospect Park Handbook, who writes the foreword, a very brief one, but a very distinctive one, Marianne Moore. So the two of them had a very close working relationship. And it seems that Clay was able to get her to be politically active, probably some of the only times in her life, where she actually went and testified at some civic committee meeting trying to save the Prospect Park boathouse from being torn down.
Oh, that's great. Now, I want to go back to Otis and Nancy. So not only did you work with him, you got to know him, and you visited him. And in some of the notes you shared, Otis, you tell a story of coming to visit, or one of these situations where I think it was in the middle of his yoga hour, and he was standing on his head. So tell us, bring him to life for us a little more.
Would you like to explain about our Bridgehampton astonishing our fellow beach club members?
Well, we saw him stand on his head many times, but this was really funny. We were down at the beach with a whole bunch of people in the summer, and he just went off a little ways and stood on his head for half an hour at the edge of the...
He regularly stood on his head. He had a regular yoga period from 5 to 7 each day, every day that he could manage it. And that included a half an hour standing on his head. It was quite a remarkable thing to observe. But he had wonderful interpersonal, speaking of all the things he was able to do with people, he had incredible interpersonal skills. He had a wry sense of humor that was very appealing to people. He was full of witticisms. He could hardly get a paragraph out without a pun. So he was a very enjoyable, he was an ascetic. I think an ascetic is a good word for him, but it misses a lot of him because he was a fun person with a great sense of humor and was a joy to be with. And that's how he entranced all these audiences. I can't tell you how many meetings we had with hundreds of people. Once he took the stage, he became a rock star, and all of his events were sellouts, and people wanted to be with him. So he really was quite a remarkable person from so many different angles.
Well, he sounds like a real people's person, yet on the other hand, solitude was important to him. No phone kind of thing. So it's kind of interesting that there was maybe part of him was an extrovert and part of him was an introvert. I don't know.
I think that's a very fair, very fair commentary. He liked both. He liked people, but he liked to get away from people. And he wanted the ability to do that. And ultimately, that's what took him away from Nantucket. His departure from Brooklyn Heights was precipitated by that break-in. He felt very violated. He had to leave. And so he went to Nantucket, but Nantucket got to be crowded and touristy. He didn't like that either. And so he was game to return to Kentucky when offered an opportunity for a house he knew well. And off he went in 78. Actually, we visited him in Nantucket just in time at 9 Beaver Lane because later that very year, he headed back to Kentucky.
Give us just some dates. So he left Brooklyn Heights when roughly? Well, it won't be roughly.
At the end of 1970. The break-in was in July, and as soon as he could make arrangements to leave, he left. He had been restless. He really did feel he did not like the noise and bustle of a city. He loved being in the city. It had all the culture that he thrived on, but still he didn't want to be there. And so really in the late 60s, he began looking around for a place to escape to. And indeed, we showed him a house that we've discovered together on the North Fork of Long Island. I thought that it was a perfect house for him. It lacked the cultural surround that he needed, which was lucky for us because we then got the house and moved it down to Bridgehampton from the North Fork. And we still
in the family.
And we still have it. And Melissa, who I think is probably on this program, lives there now with her family.
Oh, wonderful. So off to Nantucket, 1970, and then in Nantucket through 78.
78. He left in 78.
Okay, great. And then to Kentucky, where he spent the rest of his life.
Right, in a real sanctuary. It was a perfect place for him to end his years because it was close enough to Lexington. Jim was at about 15 miles away from downtown Lexington or something like that.
An hour.
And that the house that you see on the screen in the back is the original house to which he made that extension on the right. And then to the right of that is where he kept his inventory of books. And right in front of us is the picture of his guest house, which he designed after an Athenian, or at least a Grecian, water tower. And that was his guest house. It was a perfect place for him to retire because it was surrounded by woods. He loved the deer. He loved all the animals. And yet he was very deeply involved in culture in Lexington and throughout Kentucky.
Jim, you had mentioned, I think it was you or maybe Gay or both, that the kind of connections and circles he was part of in New York City. And I was delighted to hear that he and Talbot Hamlin had been colleagues, because that's another great name out of preservation history and very important figure in the 50s and all. But maybe we could dwell on that a little more, just to give us a sense of who else he was in touch with, both in obviously Brooklyn Heights, but it sounds like the city cultural scene was something that he was a part of, or at least connected to.
Yes, you could see in the foreground of that photograph the octagonal tower, and the octagonal tower was his guest house, and he had one guest, Roger Moss, who was the director of the Philadelphia Athenaeum, who came down and tried to persuade Clay to give his papers to the Athenaeum, which didn't succeed. But Jimmy Barker, who was the art dealer in Nantucket, also was an art dealer in Palm Beach. And I remember being at Clay's once, and suddenly a car comes driving through the carriage circle, and Clay stands up and says, "It's Jimmy Barker." and suddenly it was like a theater, as if you were in a play. And Clay loved the theater, but so it was a perfect setting for that kind of thing. Apparently, once Clay, the phone rang one morning, and a voice said, "Clay, have you looked out on your patio?" And he said, "No, I haven't." And he said, "Well, go have a look." And Jimmy Barker had left a dozen chairs for his conference table in the banqueting house. So they were great friends. But there were many people who knew Clay and that Clay corresponded with, and there were many in Kentucky as well as in New York and elsewhere. He was interested in Green and Green, the arts and crafts architects and bungalow architects in California. And he goes out to California and he interviews them. And I've had correspondence from people asking me, can you tell me about Clay's interviews? And I go and find the paperwork on that. You get queries on various aspects of Clay's work. But to pivot briefly, here we have Clay's book, Old Brooklyn Heights. And here we have a book in 1978, which Clay would have been working on in Nantucket. And it's called Vestiges of the Venerable City. In a way, I think it was probably, the idea was suggested to the people in Lexington by Old Brooklyn Heights. And so the Lexington Fayette County Historical Society has Clay write this book about the Chronicle of Lexington, Kentucky, its architectural development and survey of its early streets and antiquities. And he calls it Vestiges of the Venerable City because his concern is about what's left of Lexington, because urban renewal had just been underway. And there have been a great deal of destruction and loss of architecture in Lexington. And so Clay writes introduction. It's so acid that the commission writes back to him and says, Clay, we can't possibly use your preface. It's terrible. We can't let it loose. And so they got rid of it, and they had another fellow, Burton Millward, write the introduction instead. But Clay writes back to the chairman of the commission, a fellow named Buddy Thompson. And he says that this is to show Clay not just as a documentarian, but as an advocate as well. You do not gain anything by remaining a non-entity, too meek to speak up against those in power. Brooklyn Heights covers 50 blocks. Carroll Gardens is composed of upwards of 70 blocks. That is well over 100 blocks in the greatest city in the United States that I have been the prime mover in getting protection for as historic districts. I assume this to have been the reason that you hired me, to give you some instrument that you could use in furthering the cause in Lexington. Need I mention that to date, all your efforts combined have succeeded in getting only one block under historic protection. Yet you presume to tell me how it should be done.
Oh, that's...
From a man who drank green tea, stood on his head, and ate only vegetables.
Well, and it sounds like a very good advocate. So that is terrific. Well, we've been having a lot of fun with questions from me, or I've been having a lot of fun with questions from me. So now we're going to open up. Brad is going to magically manage the mic and solicit a few questions. And then I think we want to make sure at the end we just leave a little time in case there's an insight or something from Gay, who knew him the longest, that we've missed, just some aspect of the man. But let's go to the phones. Who do we have?
We also have to make sure, Tony, that we mention our book winner at some point here.
Oh, absolutely.
But
that presumes we've had a donor or two. So thank you, whoever that was.
We have had some, yes. So let's go now to some of the questions. Robert Grace, I'll unmute you and feel free to ask your question. Go right ahead.
I wanted to ask, because I'd heard about Gladys James before. I wanted to know if Clay knew Gladys James.
The answer is yes.
Sure.
Gladys James was sort of the grande dame of Brooklyn Heights. In her own way, she initiated preservation. Her system of preservation was to buy the houses and wait for appropriate times to distribute them to proper people. She saved a lot of houses that way, but she ran across Clay in so many different contexts. I don't think they were close, but she had a high respect for Clay because it was his book. We had meetings in her wonderful top floor overlooking the harbor, in which we used Clay's book as the vehicle to try to seduce people in power to do the right thing. And she was very much aware of his huge contribution to that process.
Didn't she also whisper in Robert Moses's ear on occasion in ways to help save Brooklyn Heights? But I know it's another story. But
it is a different story, and probably we ought to not get into the depths of that. But
we'll save it then. We'll save that for another call.
She was a very influential woman.
Okay.
Brad.
We have two questions that I'm going to combine into one and let Carolyn Robb ask that question. So Carolyn, just give me one moment here, and you are unmuted. Go right ahead.
Yes, I'm wondering, where is the bulk of what he his papers? Where are his papers, his archive? I'm looking right now on the site, but I can't.
Clay's papers are principally at Warwick. The top floor of the tower is his archive, and all of the manuscripts for his books are there. Then he has, in the basement of the Moses Jones house, he has a big bank of file cabinets, which has his research notes on the Kentucky buildings and other buildings and some of his correspondence and so forth. He had about 3,000 Kentucky photographs, small pictures. He had just sort of a rather crummy little camera, and he had no flash, he had no tripod, he had no lenses, he had no filters. He would put the camera down on the floor and push the button until he thought he had a good picture, or hold it on top of a car. And so he had all these pictures that he used to make drawings from. And so he gave those photographs to University of Kentucky, and also his Kentucky slide collection. There's still, I'm sure, several thousand slides that he used for his lectures in New York that are in a closet in his bedroom out at Warwick. The material is there, and occasionally, Otis will ask for something, and I'll dash out and fill out a file drawer, and there's no Xerox machine.
You're pretty marvelous in finding those things. I now have in the room that I'm sitting in a set of his slides for all those slide lectures that he delivered to all kinds of groups in Brooklyn Heights.
Yes.
Thanks to your ability to retrieve from the archive.
Okay.
Yes, that's the armchair tour, I think, that we put together.
Excellent.
As a PDF.
We have one more question here, and well, one question, then if anyone else has one more that crops up, we probably have time for that, but I'm going to unmute, or if you want to unmute yourself, David Nathans. Go right ahead, David. Well, I will just ask the question on his behalf, which was, did he work with or know David Woods in Nantucket? And I'm not sure if anyone on this call will know, but.
I certainly don't know.
Okay, that's one for the future. David, I see you're unmuted. Would you like to elaborate on who that was? Sorry.
Well, that may have to, we may have to follow up on that one, Brad.
That we'll wait for our full program on the treasure trove of Clay Lancaster documents that have come in. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions here. So at this point, I just wanted to say thank you to all of our speakers and guests who joined us today. It was so fascinating to have people who really, truly knew this giant of New York preservation, and someone who was really there at this crucial, pivotal moment that made a major difference as to the overall trajectory of the city's preservation paradigm. So thank you to Otis and Nancy. Thank you to Jim, Tony. We greatly appreciate it. And right now I'm going to unmute everyone. So in case you feel like clapping, you can do so. And now, for the moment you've all been waiting for, looking over here through the winner of our copy of Old Brooklyn Heights, the book by Lancaster himself, goes to Derek Krellstad. So congratulations, Derek.
Thank you.
And truly, thank you to all of you who donated and participated today. We're so glad you joined us. And we hope you'll join us again soon. We have a NYPAP hour, a happy hour for preservationists this Friday, 5:45. And another coffee break chat next week on Wednesday.
Why?
Nancy and Otis, I've unmuted you, so go right ahead.
Well, I want to thank Melissa for sitting through all of this. She actually knew Clay. There are some pictures that I have tendered to you, Brad, that show her with Clay in Kentucky when we visited him at Warwick. And there is also a picture of Melissa in front of Clay's 9 Beaver Lane house in Nantucket.
Amazing.
Where she witnessed when we arrived at that house in Kentucky, had a side garden. And it happened that we arrived in that period between 5 and 7 when he does his yoga. And there he was as we arrived, standing on his head.
Very nice.
I think her best recollection was the vegan thing. He loved any kind of an animal, insect, it didn't make any difference. And he had a special technique that he developed for catching flies with a sponge so that he could release them outside alive.
That's right.
Really?
Vivid memories, really.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, no, I think we may have to do a whole nother oral history on this just to capture all of this.
And chopsticks. I think that was the first time I ever used chopsticks, was eating with him.
Wow. Fascinating. All right. Well, thank you so much again. This was just great. And it's just invaluable to have people who actually knew him bring him to life. It made all the difference. So thanks.
Thank you, Brad.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.
Thank you. Bye. Good job, everybody.
Yes. Wonderfully done.